Michael Warady is president and co-founder of the Sylmar Group, a holding company buying and building services business in the water and wastewater sector from founders and entrepreneurs who have reached a transition point in their career. So more silver tsunami time. Um, Prior to founding Sylmar, Michael led infrastructure development projects and was a member of Growth State's equity investment team at Aquitecture, where he developed centralized and decentralized infrastructure projects such as seawater desal and wastewater reuse. And prior to that, he led international supply chain efforts for Clean Energy Associates, a solar procurement company, and a quality assurance firm based in Shanghai. And he's done a bunch of other things, but we're going to transfer over to Aaron Tartakovsky. Is someone well known locally. He's the co-founder and CEO of Epic CleanTec, and which is based in San Francisco. It's a sustainability startup redefining how cities manage their water resources. He previously served as the director of business development and marketing at CB Engineers, and he also ran its R&D division. And but prior to that, he actually worked in federal politics and has remained active in public policy at local, state, and national levels. He's a frequent speaker and with some polish and on water and clean tech issues. And he is going to take over for me as kind of an interviewer and just for also they'll get into that. Michael is actually an investor on the board with Epic CleanTech, and so we have the investor investee relationship going on as well. So take it away, guys.
Michael, let me just start by saying thank you, Dennis. I don't think I could ever properly fill in for you. How could anyone fill in for the great Dennis Murphy? But just to give some context to this panel, to everyone on, I'm Aaron, the other guy is Michael. This panel came about just because I was talking to Dennis about sort of something that would be interesting, sort of an interesting idea. And I thought, well, how about rather than just talking about having a bunch of investors talk about what they look for in an investment in the water space, we would have both a startup, me, as well as an investor, Michael. And I think the reason why I thought Michael was a really interesting person for all of us to hear from is not only has he worked at startups and not only has he worked as an investor, but he actually, I think Michael, a week and a half ago, raised a round and doing some really interesting stuff in the water space. So I'm actually going to get out of the way. Michael's going to take it away here, and then we'll reconvene at the end for a little bit for a conversation slash maybe a stand-up comedy set, depending on how me and Michael are feeling. So is that right?
I was planning the punchline was going to be Phil's Fill Station for everyone that was there on the last session.
All right. Well, with that, I'm going to step away, and I'll join back at the end. Michael, take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Aaron. And thanks, Dennis. Yeah, I mean, so really what I want to focus this presentation on, and I promise I'm not going to just talk at everybody for a long period of time. You know, the goal here will be probably a 15-minute kind of perspective in terms of like, what does investments in water look like? What are some of the various avenues that we've seen in the space that have gone after investments? Some of which I think are which I'll include Sylmar and my company in as somewhat novel as compared to what folks have been investing in over the past several decades. And then really the last piece will be just Aaron and I talking both from a investors and investees perspective in terms of how can we kind of start to implement new technologies, new policies, new regulations, and new infrastructure, because we do know that there is a huge gap in terms of how our infrastructure works today and how it's financed, and what the next generation should reasonably expect. So Dennis gave a quick intro, but just a quick background. You know, my kind of entry into clean tech started off in solar energy. Actually spent several years abroad in China doing solar panel manufacturing. So when you think about, you know, what are you probably heard throughout today's presentations about this whole decentralization thesis, even kind of decentralized wastewater reuse. And so I think in some respects, the water and wastewater industry and the investments going into it are mirroring some of those decentralization, digitization theses that have already taken place in energy and telecom. And so really thinking through how can we, while understanding that, water is very cheap, it's undervalued, it's not oil, but how can we think about how will decentralization drive some of the innovation that we see over the next several decades? Again, water and wastewater, won't bore you all with this too long, but really it's all of the clean water that comes to our tap or to our commercial high rises or to our infrastructure or our industrial facilities, and all the wastewater that gets flushed away and gets cleaned up before being discharged to the environment, right? So thinking about it at a high level from an investor's point of view, first you have to get an understanding for like what is actual water, what is wastewater, and how can we figure out a way to both create return on investment, but also protect human health and the environment. And so what we've done at Sylmar is tried to, again, think about it both from a top-down and a bottom-up perspective, right? Where the water industry is roughly the transportation and treatment of water and wastewater at a high level, right? It's a huge global industry, $740 billion. It's such a big number, it really doesn't make sense. It doesn't mean anything. But of which of that, $80 billion is kind of the North American water treatment spend every year, so not including transportation. And this is growing at a pretty steady rate, right? That when people talk about water investments, a lot of times you'll hear the term kind of a non-correlated return. What that really means is when the real estate market dropped out in 08, the water industry just kind of continued to plug along. When the dot-com bubble burst, the water industry just kind of plugs along, right? So when you think about water investments, a lot of times venture capitalists or private equity firms will think, we're going to go and get that hockey stick style growth, and our equity investment is going to be the next Facebook. And I think I tend to push back on that assumption, right? There are a lot of really great, interesting technologies out there, but understanding that the water industry, it grows very steadily, but not very fast. And that's because the water industry has been around for a couple hundred years, and it's going to be around for a couple hundred more. And so you have to make decisions based on that time frame. And so when we think about transportation and treatment, that's at the high level, but obviously it's incredibly insufficient, right? When you have to think about water investments, especially when you're thinking about private investments and not necessarily kind of municipal bonds, there's an entire supply chain within this industry that makes the industry grow. And that's everything from distributors and reps to the water quality labs that are doing the quarterly and annual water analyses, the engineering, procurement, construction companies, in Phil's last presentation, the folks that are actually, pouring concrete and breaking ground. And then, the last one for kind of the biggest environmental regulation we're going to see in the next 10 years likely will be around the kind of proliferation of PFAS compounds, the per and polyfluoroalkyl compounds. And these are the things in your Teflon or your waterproof jackets. And we're seeing a huge surge in the need for environmental remediation firms and new novel technologies that are going to kind of, I'll say, clean up those sources, but do so at a very cost-effective and economic way. So this slide is really just to show you it's a massive market. And when you think of massive market, you also have to understand what are the subsegments of the market that are growing at a relatively fast rate. So on the top right, it might be hard to see, but what we've done is try to break down over some of the leading industrial sectors, kind of how do we see annual growth rates over the next several years. And so you'll see, and maybe unsurprisingly, oil and gas, fracking flowback treatment, we're expecting to actually see a decline in annual growth rates. And this is actually courtesy of Global Water Intelligence. But on the other hand, when we see microelectronics, data centers, pharma, can you think of anything more important than having clean water going into pharma production at this stage in our vaccine creation? We're seeing kind of massive growth opportunities in providing services and technologies to those spaces. And then any great investment in the water space has to think long-term, right? So again, going back to this idea of a venture capital firm or a private equity firm that's looking at kind of a 5 or 7 year turnaround, it is very tough. But when you think about it on a kind of a multi-decade time frame, you also have to take into account various macro trends. And so the two, I'll say, predominant trends that we're really focused on at Sylmar are climate change, right? So when you think about our existing water and wastewater infrastructure, when you think about Houston after Hurricane Harvey being underwater for days, project that I worked on an emergency purchase order, or Sandy in New York City and water treatment plants going down. What we are seeing is a real need to decentralize, make more resilient, make more robust solutions that I think inherently are going to be relatively focused on decentralization, but also increased monitoring, both on flow rates, but also on ongoing quality. And then similarly, and we've heard it many times today, just a chronic underinvestment in our water infrastructure. So the American Society of Civil Engineers says that we have about $1 trillion deficit in maintenance, a D scorecard in terms of our infrastructure today. And so really what we need to focus on is not just saying, private industries, Sylmar is going to come in and spend $1 trillion on water infrastructure. I don't think that's the real role. But I think what we need to think about is kind of an investment portfolio where obviously government is going to play a part, but also private industry is there to create more innovative solutions, more cost-effective solutions, such that we can maintain and kind of enable a new generation of infrastructure. And then as to COVID, first of all, hope everyone's doing okay and that families are happy and healthy. COVID's been terrible for everyone. But what we've seen in the water industry is that, I think for the first time in my life, I have family members and friends coming to me and saying, oh, I didn't realize that water and wastewater was so important to my life. And so, here what we've seen is, March, April, May, a lot of folks were shut out of sites. People couldn't get deliveries done. But since then, the water industry has really kind of climbed back up and started to have a lot of success. Again, in understanding that, frankly, on the clean water side, one of the best ways to disinfect yourself is to wash your hands. And on the wastewater side, we've seen a lot of really interesting stuff from firms like BioBot that are actually tracking the prevalence of COVID in wastewater to really try and create more of a pool testing mechanism rather than having everybody do swab testing, which has been really fascinating to see. So kind of jumping into what do investors do here in this space? I've kind of talked at a high level about a few different folks, in terms of venture capital and private equity, which I'm assuming some folks are familiar with here. But on the venture capital side, we're seeing quite a few firms coming in and basically providing early stage, seed funding, maybe Series A funding to help firms get off the ground and start growing. So these are typically focused on, I'll say, small scale businesses today, but that have a lot of potential to grow, or new technologies, right? So, I think one of the, obviously Epic, I think is a great example here, and we can talk about that. But also, firms like Zero Mass Water raised a great seed round a few years back and has since raised a couple corresponding rounds really to get off the ground. Private equity is probably the predominant acquirer of private businesses in this sector. And so they're typically acquiring either majority shares or complete acquisitions of larger firms, typically kind of $5 million in EBITDA, $5 million in profit and up. But we've also seen a lot of what I'll call more novel private equity funds that are getting more involved in the real assets or infrastructure space. And that is, the folks that are, for those familiar, the Carlsbad desalination plant took on a very large private equity check from a firm called Stone Peak Infrastructure, kind of on the range of $170 million. And so those plants and those large projects are few and far between. But private equity has begun to get more involved in kind of the day-to-day operations of a lot of different water companies. And then just quickly, impact investing. A lot of people are getting involved in how can we make our water cleaner, make it more sustainable. Kind of bottom of the pyramid is a term that you'll hear a lot about. How can we clean up water in places like India or various countries in Africa or China, where I spent some time, and doing it so in a way where it's not just focused on maximizing return on investment, but also in terms of understanding there's kind of an ESG goal to a lot of these new technologies that are coming out here. And then public equities, investing in firms like Xylem, Danaher, Evoqua. There's a few different ETFs that are out there right now where you could actually buy shares and kind of get on the coattails or the macro trends of water becoming more important. But then lastly, and it'll kind of transition to where Sylmar might be a little bit different, there are various alternative investment structures that are being created recently that are really focused on trying to think of water as a tangible resource that's going to be very, very important over the next several generations. So Renewable Resources Group is kind of one of several firms that are investing in long-term groundwater rights. An incredible amount of respect for the team over there. And then Sylmar Group, our focus, as Dennis mentioned, was we have a very large silver tsunami that is already hitting us, right? $10 trillion of assets across 12 million businesses in the United States is going to change hands over the next couple of decades. And so there's both technology, solutions, but also institutional knowledge that is going to be lost when that happens. And so Sylmar, our goal really is to think not on a 5 or 7 or 10-year time frame like a typical investment fund, but really to think about how can we be structured as a company that we can go out, acquire businesses, and hold them for multiple generations. And that's really where we see an opportunity to kind of differentiate ourselves, but also to mirror our investment thesis with the relatively slow-moving conservative approach within the water industry. And I think as especially with COVID, and as we've seen how a lot of success has been had in the industry, stability at least. We've seen a lot of larger institutional investors coming in and making investments. So folks like Morgan Stanley Infrastructure Partners bought Aquaventure, which is the 7 Seas Water. KKR and XPV obviously are well-known funds that have joined together. And then Carlyle obviously has been doing a lot of work in this space as well. So this slide, and this will all be recorded and shared, so I won't spend too much on it, but really to say that we do have a lot of strategics, both on the company side, but also on the investor side, that are really making a lot of great movements in the water investment space. And then last but not least, this is just a graph I put together showing how the water industry kind of long-term performance actually is incredibly strong. So you typically think of CleanTec as not being a great investment, but here, if you think about 10-year, I think 10-year pre-COVID, we're matching up almost exactly with the S&P 500. And so it's choosing not just kind of early stage technologies to invest in, but kind of creating a diversified water portfolio is a really great way to invest in the space. And then, last but not least, we'll just, Sylmar, like I said, we're a multi-decade long time frame company. Our goal is to kind of eliminate arbitrary investment horizon, right? Our goal is to continue to reinvest, go buy companies, acquire companies, kind of build off of the legacies and the foundations of kind of the small, medium-sized businesses that are kind of the backbone of the water industry across the country. And then rather than selling, really just kind of hold on and kind of grow something over a long period of time. So with that, I think we have about 10 minutes left, and I realize I'm probably the only thing standing in between you all and happy hour. So let me pass it off to Aaron. Maybe we can do a few questions, or Aaron, if I missed anything, feel free to jump in.
No, not at all. But one correction, it's not happy hour. It's something even better, which is Felicia, Chris, and Debbie. So we are in the unenviable position of having to chat before these three leaders in our industry come forward. But Michael, first of all, congratulations on closing a round.
Thank you.
During a global pandemic, when people are typically sort of tightening the purse strings, we similarly went through that process. We actually had an investor who was signing paperwork for us in March while he was in bed with COVID. So
similar stories. We actually signed our first letter of intent with an investor the day before Los Angeles shut down. So just a crazy time for everybody. But congrats to you as well.
So let me ask you a question. You have the benefit of coming both from first the energy world into the water world, and there's a statistic I saw, which I'm sure people on this listening in here could probably correct me, but I saw a statistic once that there's about 50% more federal R&D into the energy world than into the water world. Now, I'm looking at the companies that you put up on your slide, companies like Danaher, Xylem, Suez, big, massive companies. Now, when you go to the street and you stop a random passerby and you ask them, name me some exciting energy companies, people will come up with SunPower or Sunrun, or they'll come up with Tesla. They're more familiar with the space. You don't really see that in the water industry. So I'm curious, sort of, if you have any commentary on why that is, why it is that for something as big and massive and pervasive as water and wastewater industries, why is it not as familiar with the everyday person, and even more so the everyday investor?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I don't have an answer. But what I would say is, I guess I'd push back on the assumption just a little bit. Because I was thinking about it as you're talking about that, I think people do have an idea of a couple water companies, right? People know the Culligan Man, people know Brita, people know their local water utility. What they don't know are all of the firms that go into creating those solutions for them, right? I mean, this is inherently kind of not a B2C business. It's not business to consumer. It's typically business to government, business to business. And so those are inherently kind of behind the scenes transactions and brands that are taking place. With that being said, I think the water industry as a whole could do a much better job of kind of showing the world how important we are. And I know, Epic, obviously, Aaron, you've done a great job of kind of creating your brand. And I think obviously you have visions of becoming kind of the Tesla of wastewater reuse, or the SunPower of wastewater reuse. But I think the goal is really to, I think in California, for example, people understand, in Southern California in particular, the scarcity of water. And so as they think about brands of how it influences their lives, it's things like Rainbird, right, in their sprinkler systems, or Brita, or the Culligan guy that's putting an RO system on their under sink filter. And so really what I'd say is, one, I think there are brands, but two, I'm not necessarily sure it's all that important that the everyday individual on the street needs to know about who's kind of providing the activated carbon to their local utility.
No, that's a very fair point. And I think some of the brands you pointed out are sort of front of mind for folks. And not to just be pessimistic, I think on the optimistic side, again, I'm coming from less the utility side and more sort of the startup, the innovation space, where I remember a few years ago, Y Combinator, the sort of legendary Silicon Valley incubator responsible for X percentage of all the big startups out there. They issued a call for water startups. And I remember that was big, that was exciting. And I think just a few years ago, we went from one or two water accelerators, maybe a decade ago, to now we have many of them. Imagine H2O, which is one that we're part of. You have sort of WaterStar, you have Current, you have all these different places that are trying to foster this type of innovation. What do you think is accounting for that? Why is it all of a sudden there's sort of a surge in this fostering innovation is not new, but sort of this recalibration of the water space towards fitting how other industries are doing innovation?
Yeah, right. I mean, so you made the point earlier about how the energy industry has 50% more R&D. I think it was like 50% more patents, if I remember the same article, than the water industry does over the past 50 years. And I think where people have been talking about water as the new oil for decades. And frankly, people have been trying to figure out, how do we invest in water for the last several decades? And a lot of them have failed. And I think it's important to kind of understand that some of the implications of underinvesting in water are finally starting to kind of come to fruition. And so I think that's with the broadest stroke, that's why Imagine H2O, WaterStar, Current are starting to pop up, is because we finally realized that, one, all these operators are going to, or 50% of the operators are going to retire in the next 20 years. And two, the water industry really hasn't taken advantage of the new digital solutions that we all have. And so I think really what folks are seeing now is, maybe this isn't kind of a perfect corollary to energy, but there's a really incredible investment opportunity here if you play it right. And so I guess the one last thing I'd just say is, the average, this is a courtesy of another kind of conference I went to a year or so ago, but the average time frame for a new technology in the water sector going from idea to first commercial client is 7 years, right? Which is the average length of a venture capital private equity fund. And that's your first sale. And so it's really hard in this space to kind of go under normal timeframes. And so that's where, where Sylmar is really focused on, is how do we also invest in kind of the existing stable, profitable, cash flowing businesses that are already out there that are servicing the industry that really could just add on new technological solutions or digital solutions to enable that next generation of kind of improved infrastructure.
So we got 45 seconds left. So I'm going to ask you a question. Based on what you just said, the long time frames, the long sales cycles, the fact that there are a lot of big issues in the water industry, and this is not the easiest industry to innovate in, even though we have people who work 24/7, who I think of as first responders, who make all of this work. It's tough. So what keeps you excited every day when you wake up, besides getting to talk to me? What keeps you excited about working in this industry?
That privilege obviously is unmatched, Aaron. However, I think what gets me most excited, kind of why, everyone I talk to in the energy industry, when I tell them I go to the water industry, they think I'm crazy, right? Because energy's fast moving, a lot of stuff's happening. But I think water, we've kind of reached a bit of a tipping point where we have all the technologies and all the solutions we need. And now we just need to go implement it, right? We got to go find the right people. We got to bring in smart people. We have to go find novel financing structures, just like rooftop solar did. And we have to also push regulators to move in a direction that is more amenable to new technology innovation, more installations of like decentralized epic systems, because that's what the world needs, right? It's incredibly hard to build new, large, centralized infrastructure in America today, kind of hard stop. And so now we have to figure out, like, if that is the case, how do we create new solutions that go fix this problem? And I think we're finally at a point, to your question of how do I get out of bed in the morning? I think we're finally at a point where people are beginning to realize that. And so it feels like a real opportunity, both on the investment and the deployment side, to kind of move us all in the right direction.